right, now let's look at early small sword in the 18th century, the épée de rencontre. Now, this is where we start delving into the history of the corporation of fencing masters. So, under Charles IX, as I mentioned before, in 1567, this is where they get a royal charter to establish their corporation and decide who is qualified to teach fencing. So there is a long-running debate, as always, about different schools of fencing. The French school, and this is coming from me, and we know my great admiration and appreciation for the French school. The French school comes directly from the Italian school before it. And I will point out some things that help highlight that. Clearly in the late 1500s, they're using the same type of weapon. They're using the same training tools. And under Charles IX, if you're looking at the slide here, you see some of the first fencing masters are Pompey, right? Master arms to the king. He was Italian. Noel Carré, he was the fencing master to the pages of Catherine de' Medici. He was Italian. Henri de Saint-Didier, not Italian, but right, the two fencing masters first listed are really high up in the pecking order, as it were, because they are working with the nobles directly, especially if you're the fencing master to the king. Right? And Henri de Saint-Didier, he published the book in 1573, and what he is showing in the fencing treatise is very similar to what the Italians of the time are also demonstrating in theirs. He's not doing anything radically different than what the Italians are already doing for that time. In a couple years after he publishes, Saint-Didier is asked to do a fencing demonstration before the king's brother and a couple other notable figures in the French court. So Saint-Didier clearly understood what he was doing and was particularly in demand. Now, as we move forward from Charles IX, looking at his successor, Henri III there, his fencing master, Sylvie, was Italian. Several other fencing masters, and these fencing masters were part of this new corporation of fencing masters of Paris. Okay? You have Flamand and Petitjean. And in 1585, under Henry III, their charter is renewed. So they keep their stronghold on who is allowed to teach fencing in Paris and around Paris. Now, I do want to add that, that this royal charter is, grants them a great deal of power. However, even though France has a strong monarchy and is able to do a transition of power over hundreds of years, the power of the crown only truly extends to the suburbs of Paris. So there are other fencing masters teaching throughout France. Just if they are trying to teach in Paris, now they can be sued, or the laws against them, and their schools can be shut down. But there are other academies throughout France. It's just in Paris, that's where you want it to be. which is true even today. So following Henry III, logically, Henry IV. And one of the fencing masters in the court was Geronimo Cavalcabo, who becomes fencing master to Louis XIII. He was Italian. So you see a trend here. There are a lot of Italians in the Royal Academies of Paris. All right. And just to recap, again, under Louis XIII, you had Geronimo Cavalcabo was his fencing master when he was younger. You have his son, Cesar Cavalcabo, fencing master to the court, Italian. You have another Italian that was well known to the court, Paternoster from Rome, who publishes, well, he publishes a small tract about fencing, which ultimately gets wrapped into another fencing treatise later. And then we have, I have here Jean Piard, the Maître d'armes, right? And if you look at the records which Vigeant and Darici list, is that these aren't all of the fencing masters, but these are most of the fencing masters. So you're not, so in the charter, I says, at this point in time, I believe they're allowed up to 12 masters during this time. And in 1621, they alter the charter for people becoming masters. They had to serve an apprenticeship, and to test to become master, they had to test it fencing 4 different weapons in front of 6 masters to be granted their title. And during this time, you know, the charter keeps changing things. They extend the length of time. You know, the charters lay out, you know, the ranks of master, provosts, and their apprentices, right? People who are trained to become provosts and masters, and that the apprentices aren't allowed to wear a sword for a number of years. And they go from, you know, requiring 4 years of training to before you can test for master. About this time, they push it to you have to train for 6 years to before you can attempt to test to becoming a fencing master. And they also expand the number of masters who run the corporation. Now, you know, as I said, this list isn't all of the masters, but it is a good number of the masters. And under Louis XIV, the Sun King, pictured here in all of his glory, that fencing and art, right, all becomes so, it's so important to Louis XIV and the image of France, that at this, under Louis XIV, there are 42 registered fencing masters with the corporation. 42, which is a massive number compared to the amount who are registered with the corporation prior to Louis XIV. And again, this is just covering Paris and the suburbs around Paris. So some of the names I've listed here are super important because they were very famous during their day. A number of them published fencing treatises. Besnard publishes his treatise in the 1650s. I think it's 1653. Philibert de Latouche publishes. Leperche, he publishes. Labat publishes Lecoq, I haven't found anything by him yet. Liancourt publishes also, and we have their treatises available to us. And now for the first time in France in the 1650s, as I was saying, fencing really is like any other art, very important to Louis XIV, that for the first time that fencing masters have the ability, right? If you serve a length of time, and then you serve as an ancient master, working for the corporation, you now can be granted a title of hereditary. So you can get a coat of arms, in essence, right? Gain a title through being a fencing master. That is a unique thing, because these people, being a fencing master was a working class position. They didn't necessarily come from, aristocratic families. And now it's possible for them to actually move their way up the social chain in France during this time. And here's a list of fencing treatises. Oops. Where you have Hieronymo Cavalcabo's treatise, Paternoster of Rome, the tract that he wrote, Dancy, right? His Besnard. So you see a number of fencing treatises from the, just after the first quarter, all the way up to that last quarter of the 17th century. Although the very last one is a Scotsman, Sir William Hope. And the reason why I included him is because the first treatise he wrote is pretty much the French school. And he makes comparisons between the Italian and the French school, right, during that 17th century. William Hope goes on to write a very interesting treatise on his new method, which all of a sudden looks nothing like the French school. But his first treatise, I highly approve of. Now, as we're looking at by the mid 1600s, right? We're talking about this weapon where the French have decided that they are now pulling the French school away from the Italian school on how you hold the weapon and the posture that you're going to take and how you manipulate the weapon itself. So even though the French are now beginning to make it more French, they are still very wedded to precepts laid down by the Italians. So here, where you're looking at this image, and this image comes out of Latouche. So he's showing you the first guard. This is also the first guard for the Italians. And the general posture where you are solely back weighted onto the back hip, and you have that wider stance. This all comes out of the Italian school. So this isn't radically different. How they're now advocating holding the weapon, that is different. And you have the second guard. And for those of you familiar with the Italian, like, yep, looks kind of Italian. That's your second hand position. And our third guard. Now, one slight variation. Well, yep, that all looks pretty Italian. You can see the foil he's holding. It has the crown guard, right? And his left hand is removed behind him. The traditional Italian guard was that left hand in front of the chest or beside the face. And then you see the French just gradually pull the hand further and further back. And the fourth guard. So all of those positions are pretty akin to the Italian rapier, except for that backhand starting to open up behind them. And here, right, if you're in the fourth guard, your point can be ascending or descending. Now, one thing the French are really insistent upon, right? After they have changed the way you hold the weapon, where your finger's no longer wrapped around the quillon, and the weapons are now becoming more lighter and more nimble. The French are encouraging blade contact, and you have this insistent upon physically finding the weapon, and the engagement, where you deviate your adversary's point through contact with your blade. And so because of that, right, you have a low carte position, because if their weapon is low, you still want to find their blade so you can deviate the point. When you have contact with the blade, it gives you more information. And these are all concepts that the French are highly advocating for through the late 1600s. And here, much like what the Italians are doing, right, through the 17th century, they're looking at the use of the lunge, where the back foot stays put, as opposed to always attacking on the pass or angular steps, but using the lunge to facilitate the attack. And here again, it's this image of the fencing saw, beautiful. That is a fencing saw. Again, you can see the use of the lunge. And between the last image and this image, you see the figure who's taking the parry. Their arm is more extended, for those of you who practice classical French foil, right? You don't keep your arms that extended when you're making your parries. And this is a thing that is advocated early on, and it changes, right, the contact on the weapons and how the riposte occurs and what parry you can choose. The more extended you keep your arm versus retracting the arm more, it changes the play. So with that, we have now covered a brief look at the fencing masters that are influential through the 1600s. You notice that a good number of them are Italian. And the images that we looked at from Latouche, right? The postures, a lot, and even just from the guard positions, those are all influenced directly from the Italian. And it is in the 1700s, right, the French now, that they continue to insist upon, not using your finger around the quillon. The weapon becomes lighter and even, shorter. And so the postures and the choices they're making now begin to change as you look at the sword and the practice of fencing through the 1700s.